The wind in Briarwood had a habit of carrying secrets. It whispered them through the sweet gum trees and against porch swings grown still from time. In the quiet hush before nightfall, just as the sky turned lavender above weathered rooftops, the town held its breath as if remembering something long hidden, but not forgotten. That was when you could hear it, a faint bark, not frantic, not lonely, just steady. Most folks said it must have been someone's dog down near the docks or out past Miller's Hill. But anyone who listened closely knew better. It wasn't a bark to be noticed. It was a promise, a signal, like the sound memory makes just before it returns. Everyone in Briarwood remembered the little dog, but few knew where he came from, and even fewer knew where he left to. Until one day, without warning, he came back. The kind of arrival that doesn't need a doorbell. The kind of reunion that breaks a silence you didn't know was there. There are stories like this scattered everywhere, if you know where to look. Written not in ink or pixels, but in paw prints across porch dust and sudden warmth pressed against your shins. Unspoken chords that tie creatures to people, tighter than logic would like and stronger than science can measure. There was a boy, Evan Carroll, quiet in ways most people never notice, except the ones who felt hurt carved too close to the heart. He didn't ask for much, only for things not to feel like shadows anymore. The summer he turned 11, he'd already learned more about the weight of silence than most grown men twice his size. 2 years earlier, a light in their house had gone out and never fully returned. Her name was Lucy. Lucy loved 3 things: strawberry jelly sandwiches and a tattered children's book called Toby's Red Umbrella. She read it so often the corner of the front cover had nearly torn away, and Evan, a boy 3 years her junior, could recite it by heart. That book still sat on a shelf in her bedroom, the room no one had entered for a long while. Life after Lucy was quieter, not cruel, not abusive or wild, just still. Their mother made coffee without humming anymore. Their father's toolbox stayed closed on weekends, and Evan walked home alone each day, his backpack sagging, his head bowed to the sidewalk as if trying to find something no one else could see. That's how he found the dog. It was July, one of those days that sits on your skin like a held breath, warm and waiting. The kind of evening when the gas station lights hum louder and the air smells like sun-warmed gravel and spilled root beer. Evan had just stepped out, a $2 soda in one hand and the last third of his sandwich in the other crumpled ham cheese his mum had packed. A little soggy from the ice pack. He sensed it first, a presence. Not a sound, not a movement. Just the indescribable gut feeling that he was being watched in a way that wasn't threatening, just hopeful. The dog emerged from behind a dented trash bin near the ice machine. Scruffy, limping, fur speckled with dust and thistle burrs. Not large, maybe knee-high, but there was shape and substance beneath the fur, like an old soldier wearing a borrowed coat. His ears were cocked unevenly, his tail a cautious flick rather than a wag. But the eyes, they were twin coals in a driftwood, face dark, unwavering, and strangely familiar. Evan froze, then looked down at the remains of his sandwich. Without thinking, he lowered himself and held it out. The dog didn't bolt, didn't growl. He approached slowly, each post-up deliberate, circles of tired fur moving as one. He took the sandwich gently, almost reverently, and then he sat. "I'm not supposed to bring home animals," Evan said aloud, almost to himself, throat-catching. The dog tilted his head, as if he disagreed, and so Evan stood, and the dog followed, all the way home down Wilk Street, past the whitewashed fence where Mrs. Lander's wind chimes sang, past the bakery window brimming with pies, through puddles that caught bits of sky. Not once did the dog step ahead. He walked beside Evan as though they'd come from the same place, as though Lucy, somehow, had whispered from somewhere beyond, "Someone's coming for him." Evan didn't announce the dog when he reached their front gate. He opened it, let it swing shut, and waited. The dog paused, looked up once, then padded through after him. Inside, his mother stood in the kitchen, peeling potatoes. She turned. When she saw the pair of them, "Oh," was all she said first. "He was hungry," Evan replied. There was no dramatic protest, no lecture, only that quiet breath parents take when they're choosing love over rules. They made up a bed with an old towel and filled a cereal bowl with water. That night, Evan sat beside the dog on the hardwood floor and whispered, "I'll call you Toby." The dog closed his eyes. Outside, the wind moved through the trees again like fingers parting through pages. And somewhere, if you listened closely enough, you could almost hear it, a story beginning. In the dim early light of morning, Evan awoke to the sound of paws padding softly across the kitchen linoleum. For a moment, he wasn't sure it hadn't been a dream: the sandwich, the dog, the walk home. But when he tiptoed into the kitchen, barefoot and blinking, there he was, curled on the towel, as if he'd always belonged. The dog lifted his head, but didn't move, just blinked slowly at Evan, then rested his chin back down with a sigh. "Good morning," Evan whispered. He reached for the cereal bowl, now empty but licked spotless. "I'll get more." No fanfare, just the quiet of two beings colliding by accident, only to find the shape they made fit just right. Later that morning, over cereal and toast, Evan's father peered over his newspaper and cleared his throat. "So," he said slowly, "we've taken in a stray." Evan, caught mid-bite, nodded. For now. His mother glanced at the dog, now asleep again at the sliding glass door. "He's quiet," she said. "Seems gentle." Her voice didn't carry judgment, just a tinge of hesitation, as though she was speaking through memories, not directly at the moment. Evan didn't have the words for it then, but he'd remember that look for years, the cautious hope of someone who survived the breaking of something precious. "He doesn't have tags," Evan added, "and he was hungry." His father sighed, the sort of sigh that made his shoulders cave a little. But he didn't say no. That afternoon, Evan sat on the porch steps with the dog beside him. The sun lit the pale blue paint, the faded wood warm beneath their legs and paws. He traced slow circles on the dog's head, fingers brushing over one clipped ear. "You need a name," he murmured, the dog, whose gaze had followed every passing bird with the quiet patience of someone who knew waiting as a craft, shifted and rested his chin on Evan's sneaker. Evan looked across the street to the upstairs window of the room no one entered anymore. He thought of dusty bookshelves and watercolor rain clouds, of blanket forts and jelly stains, and Lucy's voice drifting through the air like childhood kept on rewind. "Toby," he said softly, "you look like a Toby." The dog didn't move, didn't bark, but something passed between them in that moment. Not an agreement, not exactly, just a gentle settling, like books returned to their rightful place. That evening, Evan rummaged through drawers until he found one of Lucy's necklaces, beaded string with a tiny silver bell once fastened to a purse strap. He looped it around a bit of twine and tied it gently around Toby's neck. It jingled faintly when he moved. It sounded like old laughter. "You're officially someone," Evan declared, smiling just a little wider than he had in years. Word got around faster than Evan expected. By the end of the week, Toby had become a familiar figure on their block. Mr. Reynolds, from across the street, swore he'd seen the dog years ago near the old train lot. Could have sworn, he said, shaking his head. But maybe I'm thinking of another. Mrs. Lander, whose wind chimes always played out tunes even when the air stood still, had set out a small bowl of scraps. For the traveller, she told Evan with a wink. Toby never strayed far, ever crossed Wilkes without Evan, never barked at passing cars. He seemed to understand boundaries better than most people. He had a gentleness that wasn't meekness, more like polite observation. He simply waited to be needed. But with Evan, he followed the school. Toby waited just short of the gates, resting under the same tree daily with paws tucked delicately and ears perked toward the sound of children's laughter to the bookstore. Downtown, where Evan stopped on Thursdays to flip through aging paperbacks. Toby sat on the doormat, never attempting to enter, never demanding attention. One quiet Sunday, Evan stood in the yard, trying to fix the tire on his bike. Toby lay nearby, blinking at the sun, when a shrill voice called from the other side of the street. "Hey, that's your dog." The kid who shouted was Mason Doyle, 3 years older and famous for his slingshot and constant smirk. Evan felt his stomach knot. "He's mine, yeah." Mason squinted. "Looks like the one who barked at my Gramps' shop years ago. Thought he disappeared. Good at tricks." Toby, as if prompted, turned his head and let out a singular soft woof. Not a warning, not even a greeting, more like punctuation. Mason raised an eyebrow. "Weird dog, yeah," Evan replied, "but maybe that's a good thing." By August, Evan's mother stopped calling their guest the dog. She started saying Toby. Small things shifted. The towel-turned bed was replaced with a second-hand dog cushion. The cereal bowl was traded for a steel water dish. His father, once uninvolved, grumbled less when dry food became a regular line item on the grocery list. Evan started sleeping better. To Dot sometimes, at night, Toby would scratch once at the door to Evan's room. Evan would open it without a word, and Toby would curl at the foot of the bed like a stitched shadow, his breathing the rhythm of steady rain. They were just beginning to find peace, to carve a quiet place into each other's hearts, when the first story arrived. It came from Nora Finch, the librarian downtown. She pulled Evan aside one day when he'd stopped to return a book. "I saw you with that dog of yours," she said, eyes narrowed in memory. "It's funny, I swear I knew one just like him." Evan tilted his head. "Yeah," she nodded slowly. "Showed up right outside our door the day my Harold passed. Just sat there all morning. Wouldn't leave." Evan blinked. "Did he? Do anything?" "No, just waited." I remember thinking he was guarding something or someone. Word spread from there, mostly whispered, most often from the older folk who leaned more heavily on memory than on fact. There was the teen who claimed Toby once led them out of the woods near Miller's Path when they were younger. A woman who believed the dog had been there the day she got the news of her son's safe return from overseas. Each time someone told it, there was a hush around the story. A sacredness, not of religion, but of quiet reverence. As if by acknowledging the dog, they were brushing fingertips against something too delicate to hold. Evan listened, never denied, never confirmed. He didn't care about what Toby might been, only that he was his now. Evan the writer, his teacher Mrs. Cho called him one day. He looked up from his page, startled, "You found your voice," she said, smiling gently. It was true. Since Toby came, the words poured out easier. Short stories curled into notebooks, paragraphs that read like music, titles with themes of returning, of unspoken bonds, of silent guides. One September afternoon, Evan found Toby sitting in the yard, head tilted toward the waning sun. The leaves had started to turn, whispering change. Evan sat beside him on the grass. "You know," he murmured, "I think. Maybe you were always supposed to find me." The wind stirred, and Toby didn't move, just looked ahead, as if he remembered to. In Briarwood, stories never arrived with fanfare. They rustled in through half-shut windows, rode along the bell of a bicycle, or came tucked in the corner of a neighbor's voice. And by the fall of that year, stories about the dog named Toby had begun to take on a life of their own. Mrs. Lander claimed he kept watch in front of her hydrangeas during an unexpected visit from her son, who hadn't been home in 4 years. Said he arrived to find Toby perched like a statue, facing the driveway just moments before the taxi rolled in. Elsewhere, folks cited smaller miracles. A toddler wandered off during the town Thanksgiving picnic, and panic swelled like a rising tide. But Toby had found hurt tucked beneath the playground slide, chewing solemnly on a plastic duck. He didn't bark, he didn't run for help. He simply stayed close, body curled gently around her like a moat. "And that's just the kind of dog he is," someone would whisper, not loud, not dramatic, just there where you need him. It became something of a secret understanding. Toby was more than a pet. He was presence, poem in motion, the unspoken breath of calm between the chaos. Evan knew it too. At school, while other kids played wall ball or sketched dragons in their notebooks, Evan wrote stories, paragraphs about animals that guided dreamers. Fiction, sure but close enough to truth. He had started bringing his notebook to the hill behind school, where a weeping tea tree cast long shadows over afternoon grass. Toby waited there every weekday, lying beneath the same patch of sky, facing the same direction as the classroom windows. Evan never instructed him. Toby simply knew. Sometimes Evan read aloud to him when the other kids had gone home. His voice tangled in the gentle flick of a tail and blink of patient brown eyes. One chilly evening, Evan stopped by the bookstore downtown, the one painted egg blue with ivy around the sign. Thursdays had become their ritual. He'd browse the shelves near the dusty back corner, Toby curled outside the door like punctuation. The owner, a sharp-eyed man with spectacles that looked older than the books, would always nod at Toby, then murmur to Evan that he's got the air of something older, don't he? Like he remembers before we forgot. Evan never quite knew how to respond to that, but the words clung to him more tightly than he let on. Then winter came. Not all at once, just flickers at first, jackets lingering longer on hooks, clouds moving. In like cautious guests, the town shifted. Children played inside. Chimneys breathed again, and still Toby stayed constant. Snow began whispering against the rooftops in early December. Just a dusting, soft enough to leave pawprints on the sidewalk like thought patterns. One morning, Evan woke early, pulled back the curtain, and found Toby in the yard. A perfect circle pressed in the snow where he'd lain. That day, he followed Evan all the way to the edge of the school lawn, then turned to watch him go with a stillness that made Evan pause. "You'll be here later, right?" Evan asked quietly. The question came out heavier than he expected. Toby didn't bark, didn't stir, just blinked. That afternoon, the snow had thickened. It clung to fence posts and crumpled mailboxes like lace. Evan slipped twice on the sidewalk, hurrying back. He ran through slanted light toward the hill behind the school, eyes already scanning, but no dog. Not beneath the tea tree, not by the old footpath, not even outside the bakery, where Mrs. Grant sometimes left him scraps of pumpkin loaf. He rushed home, checked the porch, the garden bed, even the corner where Toby sometimes watched the neighborhood like a sentry fallen asleep. On duty, nothing. The front door creaked as Evan stepped inside. "Toby," he called, though he knew it was pointless. His mother looked at him gently from the kitchen. "Didn't see him today," she murmured. "Maybe he's just ... somewhere warm." But even she didn't sound convinced. That night, Evan couldn't sleep. The silence in his room felt different, more aware of itself. He opened the window, letting in air that bit at his knuckles, hoping for a bark, a rustle, anything instead. The town had gone still in a way that felt unfamiliar. The morning after, Evan checked every corner of Wilkes Street, left flyers around town, used his saved-up allowance to print more. Mason Doyle volunteered to help. Post them up by the train lot, muttering, not unkindly, "He was a weird little mutt, but I liked him." Little acts of kindness surfaced everywhere. Mrs. Cho sent home extra flyers for Evan to hand out. The librarian offered to tack one at the front desk. But as December curled into January, hope thinned. One afternoon, Evan stood on the bridge overlooking Carolina Creek, the place where Toby had once paused and stared for long minutes into the current, as if watching time drift past. Evan dropped a small paper boat into the water and whispered, "Come home," not really expecting anything to change. The paper boat twirled once, then vanished beneath a slab of grey ice. Weeks passed. The towel in the kitchen remained untouched. The bell-strung necklace ended up on a hook behind Evan's door, still faintly warm from the dog it once adorned. He began sleeping again, but lighter, like someone listening for footsteps that never came. Neighbors still asked, not often, enough to remind him they noticed too. Any luck? They'd call gently, or still watching the fences, and Evan would nod on the outside. Inside, he wasn't sure what he believed, but he kept the twine necklace and the little steel dish, kept the shape Toby left in his heart like a space, saved for news that hadn't arrived yet. And there, with silence draped heavy as snowfall, Briarwood waited. The house felt bigger without him, not in square footage or sound, but in the spaces that suddenly felt two still chair legs unguarded, porch steps undisturbed, a food dish that remained untouched near the corner of the kitchen. Evan walked slower through the hallways now, as if quiet might somehow coax Toby's footsteps back to life. Every morning he checked the yard, as if maybe Toby had simply gone round the block and gotten delayed, a dog thing, a wandering itch. But the towel in the kitchen stayed folded, the leash never moved from the peg, and the necklace with the silver bell had stopped jingling days ago. Briarwood wasn't used to losing things. It was a town that collected time carefully in memo pads beside landlines, in half-crumbled school photos still attached to refrigerators. People misplaced keys, yes, but not living creatures, and not ones so beloved. At first, neighbors asked often, where was he last seen? Could he have gotten into one of the delivery trucks at the bakery? Might someone have picked him up? Evan answered the same each time, softly but clearly. I don't know, he was just gone. As weeks shifted into a slow January, those same questions turned inward, not out of avoidance, but as if saying them aloud only made the ache more real. And so the town began grieving quietly. Mr. Reynolds stopped putting the second biscuit on his plate, the one he always split and snuck. To Toby before his afternoon tea, Mrs. Lander left her gate open for 3 days in a row, just in case. On the 4th day, she closed it with a sigh and muttered, "Doesn't feel right anymore." The bell above the bookstore still jingled on Thursday afternoons, but Evan stopped pausing at the shelves. He returned his books silently now, eyes skimming the floor for a shape he'd once expected to see curled near the doorway. At home, his parents noticed too. His mother paused longer at the window after dishwashing, drying her hands slowly. His father added water bowls back onto the receipt list at the hardware store out of habit, then scratched them off with a grimace. No one said it, but the absence had settled in like new furniture, quiet, unwelcome, but now part of the room. Evan tried everything. He printed flyers in black and white, then went to the library to add color. He added gentle and friendly in bold letters, answers to Toby, last seen near Wilkes in Carolina. He posted them on telephone poles, grocery store corkboards, even the bulletin at the post office between the ad for lawnmower repair and a lost glove appeal from 2 Christmases ago. Kids from school helped too, their footsteps crunching beside his as they moved between blocks, taping and nodding and watching the horizon. For every flyer hung, hope stretched a little further, and then, slowly, it began to shrink. By February, the flyers were curling at the corners and bleached from frost. Some were torn by wind. Others had been papered over with spring events fundraisers, band recitals, dog adoption fairs that Evan couldn't bring himself to walk past without stopping. Once, in early March, he stood beside one of those flyers for nearly 20 minutes, staring at the list of shelters and surnames, blinking at each dog's face with a surge of guilt. Each tail and grin felt like a betrayal. He looked to recognize Toby in one worse, to stop looking altogether. Eventually, the flyer was taken down by a well-meaning custodian. Evan stopped, handing them out soon after that. The dreams changed, too. They used to be filled with Toby's silhouette darting between street lamps or waiting at the schoolyard tree. But lately, they were quieter. Evan would walk through a foggy field he didn't recognize, or ride his bike with an empty, echoing basket. And always he'd wake up with his fingers curled around nothing. He stopped checking the porch each hour after school, though his eyes drifted there anyway. One Saturday morning, his mother asked if he wanted to help reorganize the laundry closet. Evan shrugged and nodded. She didn't bring it up until they got to the bottom shelf, where a frayed tennis ball and the clipped leash still sat folded in a tin dishpan. He hesitated, then picked them up and moved them gently to a shoebox. He didn't throw them away, just contained them. "Things'll show up when they're ready," she offered, her voice soft enough not to insist. Evan didn't answer. Not then. By April, the town moved about as usual, but with the kind of adjustment usually made after a long illness or slow departure. People laughed again, but not as loudly. The smell of bread came as warmly from the bakery as it did last year. But nobody asked Toby to taste tests anymore. The school's back hill grew over with spring cotton grass, untouched. Evan's writing slowed, his stories turned shorter, thinner. He started leaving exercises half-finished in class, staring at the margins where he used to draw pawprints or lily fields, and now drew nothing at all. Mrs. Cho praised him once, in passing something about a vivid sentence, but he barely nodded. He wasn't sure his words worked the same anymore. Sometimes, when Evan walked the same streets alone, he imagined them from Toby's perspective. The things the dog must have noticed when Evan wasn't watching the flutter of a sleeve in the wind. The way sunlight made certain porch stairs glow like gold dot. How quiet they must feel now. He didn't speak this aloud. By June, it had almost been 6 months. Evan stopped setting an extra bowl of water on the front stoop. The first time the towel in the laundry pile was enough to wrap up without him crying. He felt ashamed and then, somehow, tired. He passed Nora Finch near the library one afternoon. She looked at him kindly but didn't mention the dog. She just said, "The wind's coming strong down from the hills today. You remember how he used to chase leaves?" "Silly thing." Evan smiled without showing teeth and nodded. Later that evening, back on the porch steps, he looked up at the stars, at the shapes they didn't quite form, and the distances they didn't explain. He whispered only 3 words, "I miss you," and then he sat with that truth. Not angry, not pleading, just ... still. Nearly a year had passed when the first rumor arrived. It came folded in the voice of a woman at the corner market, speaking to no one in particular as she studied cans of green beans. "Saw a dog upriver," she said. "Old one, limping on the back right." Evan didn't hear it himself, but Mason Doyle told him the next day, half serious and half unsure. "Could be yours," Mason offered with a shrug. But then again, maybe not. It was how all the stories came half-formed, soft-edged whispers, worn down by distance and time. 3 days later, Mr. Calvert, the man who fixed lawnmowers out of his shed, stopped Evan on his way home. "You had that little dog, didn't you?" he asked. Grayed face, odd ears. Evan nodded but didn't speak. His throat never worked well with hope. Calvert scratched at his beard. "My brother lives out in Halber's Point. Says a dog showed up a few weeks back. Just appeared on the porch. Sat by the door like he knew someone was in trouble." Evan's eyebrows pulled together. "What do you mean?" says his wife. "Had a seizure, first one in years. Would have died if he hadn't been home early. And even then, wouldn't have known if the dog hadn't barked his lungs off." Evan felt the shape of the words more than he heard them. Was he okay? That dog, don't know, disappeared after that. By the time they got to thanking him, he was gone. Like he was never there. Halber's Point was 20 miles away. Evan asked questions. Specific ones. What color? How tall? Did he have anything on his neck? But of course, the answers were soft. Maybe gray, someone would say. Could have been smaller. Not sure. About the eyes. No one mentioned a bell. A few others began to add their pieces, stretching back across those blank months. My cousin in Penfield said he saw a mutt out by the train tracks in March. Wouldn't come near, but stared like he knew you. Old Mrs. Keeley told me a dog slept on her stoop during the storm last fall. Kept her warm till the lights came back. Couldn't have been more than knee-high. They painted a puzzle with missing pieces and clashing colors. Enough to make Evan's heart stumble forward and then retreat. Sometimes it felt like Toby's shadow was everywhere. And sometimes it felt like people were describing ghosts. So Evan listened. He collected every story with careful silence, like a collector uncertain if their treasures were real. And then he stopped searching altogether. It wasn't a decision. Not with words. It was the day he woke up and didn't check the porch immediately. The day he passed the bakery without glancing toward the doorway. The ache stayed. But louder now was quiet acceptance. One night in August, just shy of his 13th birthday, Evan sat at the foot of his bed with the twilight pooling around him, and said, soft but aloud, "He's not coming back." It was not a look of defeat, not anger or exhaustion, just the gentle exhaustion of unanswered prayers left out too long in the rain. His parents were quiet when he told them. They didn't offer false hope or philosophical comforts. His mother only nodded once and ran her fingers along the spine of the couch cushion. That night, Evan tiptoed back into Lucy's room. First time in over a year, he stood by the bookshelf where Toby's red umbrella still leaned drunkenly to one side. He didn't touch it, didn't move anything, just breathed the air steeped in honeyed dust and memory. Then he left the door open behind him, a small change, but one that mattered. Fall came early that year. September wore soft golds and flannel. Wind and Evan's notebooks began to fill with stories, again not of Toby, exactly, but of watchful animals and people learning when to let go. Bits of him had begun rejoining the world, but sometimes when he passed by Carolina Creek or heard the jingle of a bell on a stranger's dog, his step would hesitate, just slightly, as if his body remembered what the mind had tucked away. He said Toby's name less frequently, but when he did, it came out of him like prayer. By October, the leaves fell in swarms that brushed the windows at night like tapping. Memories. Evan would sit on the porch, legs tucked beneath him, and stare into the space just beyond the street lamp glow. Sometimes, he'd imagine hearing footsteps, but he never turned around. It was the kind of spring morning that asked nothing and promised very little, modest, pale, gentle on the edges. Evan Carroll, now 14, sat barefoot on the porch, a paperback open across his lap. The spine was worn, half torn near the middle where Lucy used to fold corners when she reread her favorite parts. Toby's red umbrella. He wasn't really reading, just letting the pages fall into place as the breeze moved through them. The quiet wasn't new. It had lived with them for so long now, it no longer felt like absence, just a companion slightly out of reach. The porch creaked under the soft lean of wood warmed by speculative sunshine. A tulip bloomed in the yard, sharp red against the grass, still remembering winter. Then the bark came. Low, distant, familiar in a way that didn't need permission, to stir something loose in Evan's chest. He froze. There were other dogs in Briarwood, plenty, but not like this. Not this voice. This was something remembered in muscle more than mind, a sound that existed in his hands when they used to hold. Fur, in the curve of his shoulder where a head used to rest. He stood without meaning to. The second bark came. Closer, slower, hesitant. Evan stepped to the edge of the porch, the book forgotten on the swing behind him. He scanned the street empty, in the way a stage feels seconds before the curtain lifts. And there he was, stumbling a little, the limp more noticeable than before, fur thinner in places, now salted with grey along the jaw and above one eye. The ears were the same one, forever tilted sideways like a half-remembered question. His eyes, though still colchier and watchful, Toby. The name cracked more than the silence, it cracked something inside. Evan, he hadn't realized he was holding shut. The dog didn't run, didn't leap. Just kept walking, deliberate, one paw in front of the other, like the long road home was already behind him. Evan stepped down the porch steps. He didn't cry at first, just watched. Breath caught halfway in his throat, steps frozen in the grass. When Toby reached him, he stopped, looked up once, sat. And Evan dropped to his knees. His hands trembled when they found the fur knot, as soft as before, but thick where life had stitched itself back in. He whispered nothing at first, just pressed his forehead to the dog's tired shoulder and let his fingers remember their way through years. "You came back," he finally breathed. The neighbors noticed Mrs. Lander, on her stoop watering begonias, let the hose fall from her hands. The widow from the corner paused mid-step, breath caught like thread. Mr. Reynolds lowered the flag without knowing why. One by one, doors opened. Not wide, but enough. Enough to see what had just returned. Some people cried without embarrassment. Others stood still as fence posts. No one asked if it was the same dog. They didn't need to. He looked old, maybe older than he should have been. And yet, Toby held that same stillness, that quiet patience that had once become a language between him and the people of Briarwood. The way he blinked slowly at each face as if to reassure them. Yes, it's me. Evan's mother stepped onto the porch, her dish towel still in her hand. She covered her mouth. Her father, he bent slightly at the knees and exhaled like the air had been knocked from his spine. No one rushed. No one asked. They simply watched a boy and his dog collapse into one another's presence again. Like gravity had finally remembered, Evan whispered his name over and over, not to persuade Toby, not even to comfort himself, but to crown the moment with something he hadn't felt in years, a homecoming. The afternoon passed slowly, golden in a way that made memories easier to carry. Evan didn't leave Toby's side. They sat on the porch, the boy's hand resting in the curve between Toby's shoulder blades, like holding onto breath made solid, when the sun leaned westward and shadows began curling up their heels. Evan fetched the old dog cushion from the hall closet. It still held the belt-wine necklace tucked beside the seam. He ran fingers along its curved dot. Toby watched, ears half-tilted, as Evan knelt down beside him, tied the necklace gently round his throat. This time, the bell barely rang. Just a whisper. Just enough. Dinner came and passed. But instead of setting a place alone, Evan ate on the floor beside that old steel bowl, cleaned and filled once more. A hand in fur. A grin too big to hold. Toby's tail tapped once, twice. Like history itself had rhythm again. That night, Toby curled on the floor beside Evan's bed, in the exact groove he'd left 2 years before, as if time had only paused instead of passed. And, long after Evan fell asleep, deep into the kind of quiet only old dogs and stars respect, Toby stayed awake just a little longer, watching, making sure. The years that followed were stitched together with quieter colors, less urgent, more tender. Toby, though older now, slowed only in movement. His spirit remained undimmed, eyes still bright with the soft kind of knowing that didn't need words. To be understood, Evan grew taller, leaner, his limbs unspooling into adolescence. His voice deepened, his laugh became rarer but richer. But through it all, some things remained constant. The porch steps, the fading paint beneath their feet, and Toby, who held court on the front stoop like the town's oldest secret. He no longer rose as quickly, no longer chased windblown leaves down Wilkes Street. But he waited each afternoon if Evan didn't come home until after dark. He'd be there, curled like a comma, as if he were merely pausing between sentences, just waiting for the next story to start. The carols began to change too, in small ways. Evan's father started leaving the radio on in the garage, again soft, gospel or 70s tunes, and kept the screen door open during his weekend projects. His mother started baking the blueberry muffins Lucy used to love, sometimes without realizing it, humming faint melodies while she worked. Sometimes, Evan caught his parents sitting beside Toby on cool evenings, not speaking, just resting there, palms quietly on his fur, like they were remembering how to be whole where something had splintered. Sundays became their rhythm. After lunch, the three of them and Toby would walk slowly down to Maple Park, not to do anything, just to be. Evan would lie on the grass with a notebook, Toby curled beside him, and his parents would sit on the bench, hands lightly touching. The boy, the dog, the family in quiet mending. Toby didn't chase squirrels anymore, but he'd follow butterflies with his gaze, not trying to catch them, just watching, as if he too wondered how something so light could keep moving forward. And the stories continued. There was the woman at the hospital, a cousin of Mrs. Lander, who'd heard a soft jingle outside her window during her last days. When the nurse opened the blinds, she saw an old dog sitting still, bell faintly shining in the sunlight, eyes steady as stone. They say the woman passed with a smile, whispering, "He came." Evan didn't always hear these tales the moment they happened. They'd drift toward him in pieces, notes in library margins, quiet mentions from Mr. Reynolds after Sunday service. But every time, his response was the same, a slow smile, hand resting just behind Toby's ears. By the time Evan turned 16, Toby's gait had slowed to a shuffle, breath coming with a bit more effort. The hill behind the school had grown too steep for him to climb, so Evan brought stories down to him, instead reading aloud beneath the tea tree, even if neither of them could remember the original sentence. Then came graduation. That Evan wore his cap crooked, one tassel brushing his cheekbone. The family sat 3 rows from the back. Toby, of course, couldn't attend, too old for the folding chairs and ceremonies. But when they got home, Evan found him lying by the porch swing, eyes half closed but alert. "I did it," Evan whispered, crouching beside him. Toby lifted his head, barely. His tail made the smallest noise against the floorboard. That was enough. The night air felt sweeter that evening, not loud with parties or firecrackers, but holy, somehow, the way cornfields hold gold without asking for applause. Summer passed in warm breaths. Evan worked weekdays at the animal clinic, volunteering more than they asked. At night, he sat beside Toby with his college packet open and dreams tiptoeing in cautious excitement around his brain. He wrote stories too, ones about dogs who crossed oceans, deserts, time itself, always to return, always to rescue, not out of debt, but out of love too big to keep to themselves. Then, on a thunder-soft night in late August, it happened. No cries, no faltered whines, just a stillness. Evan found him on the porch, right where he'd always been, curled in the curve of the stucco wall, as if listening to the house breathe. The old cushion beneath him, the bell necklace at his throat, the porch swing moving slightly from the breeze. Toby was still warm when Evan bent to touch him, still had peace on him like an old coat, worn and good. His eyes were closed, as if he'd only nodded off for a moment, but the air around him knew it had lost something sacred. Evan didn't cry at first. He placed a palm on his chest, felt the silence. Then he sat beside him, knees pulled to his chest, and waited for dawn. Briarwood mourned with him. Flowers appeared tied gently to porch banisters, left in bunches on the sidewalk. Mrs. Lander put ribbons on her hydrangeas. The children at school drew chalk pawprints on the sidewalk, stretching from the playground to the library door. No speeches, no procession, only love remembered. Evan buried Toby beneath the tea tree. The town helped. A shovel passed quietly from hand to hand. Someone painted a wooden sign. Evan carved a paw in the corner. He left the necklace, bell and all, inside the grave. "It's yours," he said. "Always was." Summer faded, and so did the egg butt, never completely. The leash stayed on the hook by the laundry room, not heavy anymore, just waiting. The stories didn't stop either. They changed, twisted gently. Toby became legend, then memory, then myth. But to Evan, he was always the dog who came exactly when needed and knew exactly when to say goodbye. Evan Carroll came back to Briarwood in the fall of his 29th year, just as the leaves reached their deepest reds. The streets, though slightly more cracked, still sloped the same way beneath his tires, and the scent in the airwood smoke, mingled with sweetbread, felt unchanged, as though time had politely stepped aside to let memory through. He had a wife now, a quiet, observant woman named Myra, with roots in her smile and a softness in her step. They'd brought their daughter, Jo, who was 5 and already asking questions about the stars, and a baby due in December. New hands in an old town. Their house stood not far from where Evan had grown up, 2 turns from Wilkes. Fenced in white again, porch still creaking when stepped on just right. The tea tree behind it had grown taller, but its weeping branches still reached the same way they always had, like arms caught mid-dash hold. He hadn't planned on becoming a veterinarian, but when the moment came to choose, the answer felt like it had waited years on the edge of his throat. People in Briarwood remembered his name. "You're Lucy Carroll's brother," some said. "The kid with the dog," most said. He smiled at both and said, "Yes." He kept a photo framed on his clinic desk, not one of Bones or books, but Toby, sitting tall with his head just turned, bell at his throat. Eyes like dusk had settled inside them. Myra had asked once why no one had shot that photo until Evan did. He'd answered, "It's because he waited for someone who'd remember the shape of silence." And now, with Jo, Evan told stories. Not grand ones. Small, remembered in porch steps, and rain against windows. Stories of angels that wore fur, of quiet sentinels that didn't need wings to guide someone home. Jo listened wide-eyed, chin resting on her elbows. Was he real? She'd ask every so often. More than most things, he would say. And one morning, the wind carried something unexpected. Jo had gone off on one of her treasure walks, a sticky sandwich in her hand and a crown of clover on her head. Myra watched. From the front window, while Evan fixed a coffee, the smell of cinnamon toast curling down the hallway. Then a bark, soft, startled, hopeful. Myra turned her head. Jo had crouched by the edge of the fence. Something small, shivering, crouched beneath the mailbox. "Dog," came Jo's simple announcement. Voice bright like new crayons. She tore the sandwich in half with her toddler logic and held it out. The dog cautious, threadbare, with eyes too large for its head, sniffed once, then grumbled the tiniest sound of thanks. Evan watched from the doorway, heart thudding in patterns that didn't belong to now. The creature was unfamiliar, small, wiry, some sort of terrier mix with a tail that curled instead of wagged. But the way it looked at Jo, that blink of recognition, barely disguised as instinct, was old as stories themselves. He stepped onto the porch, coffee cooling in his grip. Jo turned toward him with a grin. "Can we keep her?" He knelt slowly. The dog sniffed, hesitated, then leaned in the barest inch. "I think," he said softly, "she was keeping us." That evening, they made a bed in the hallway. Joe insisted on naming her Pepper because, as she proclaimed, she has spicy eyes. Evan smiled but said nothing. When the house fell still and the stars blinked their long ago light across a sky. Older than grief, Evan sat on the porch and let memory curl up next to him like it used to. The breeze carried stories, ones he thought he'd stopped hearing. Whispers of fur and time-traveled steps. He remembered the boy he'd been, fractured but searching. Remembered the bark that had changed his life. How love once arrived in the shape of something lost, and now his daughter had found hers. Years ago, he had whispered 3 words to the wind, "I miss you," and tonight. He whispered them again, but not out of longing, out of thanks. Sometimes he swore he could feel it. The press of a warm body against his knee. The jingle of a bell long since buried. He looked up at the stars. "I know," he murmured. "I see her too." And in the stillness of the porch, just beyond hearing, something answered, a low, knowing sigh. The kind only old dogs make when they've come home again.